Who influenced American foreign policy? As we go through this presentation, please make sure you're aware of the key terms here. The President, the Secretary of State, the Defense Department, the CIA, the National Security Council, the NSC, the American Parliament, the Congress, both the Senate and the House of Representatives, and American public opinion, domestic policy and domestic opinion impacting as it does in a democracy. So we want you to be thinking in terms of this hierarchy. The President at the centre, influenced by these four groups in immediate proximity to the President, influenced in turn by Congress, who are expressing the views of the people, and the people themselves. Be aware that all these groups may be in conflict with each other, and that the President brings to foreign policy their own particular views and ideology. There are several spheres that influence foreign policy making in the US. A knowledge and understanding of these will be important for understanding the decisions taken during the Korean and Vietnam. The task then for you is, using the reading sheet, make notes on how US foreign policy decisions are reached. You will need to look at the following groups of people and note down what power they had over foreign policy. And there's the list from the previous slide. The President himself then, he holds executive power over foreign policy. He is also the Commander-in-Chief of the American Armed Forces. In British terms, he is both the head of state and he is the head of government. He decides on what laws to pass and with whom to make treaties. He's pivotal in foreign policy. In fact, American presidents are often, in many ways, so limited in their ability and freedom to act in domestic policy that many American presidents find their only true area in which they can express their views are through foreign policy decisions. Therefore, all the important decisions will be reached by the President. As Commander-in-Chief, he is in charge of the American Armed Forces, which after World War II were the most preeminent in the world. America was one of only two true superpowers, and of course the United States was the only superpower in 1945 that possessed the bomb. He appoints and receives all ambassadors and other key personnel, including the Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary. During a time of crisis, the President is regarded as the figurehead of the nation and draws upon the patriotism and goodwill of the American people. He relies on other groups for information, both inside and outside of his government, and these people are chosen and will often have his trust. But they are only one individual, one man, to make decisions, and information has to reach him in such quantity that it is filtered and edited, and that in itself becomes a very influential process. Every decision reached by the President is checked by Congress. The President must not enjoy sole authority to take the United States into war. The American Constitution is set up so no one individual or institution ever has too much power. The Constitution was written to prevent any abuse of power, and therefore everyone is watching everyone else to make sure that legalities are followed and no rules are being broken. So the President's relevant to the course. President Truman of the Democrat Party, 2 terms, President 45 to 1953. He was President Roosevelt's vice president and succeeded him upon FDR's death in 1945. Dwight Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, the commander of the D-Day landings and Allied forces in Europe during World War II, became the Republican president from 53 to 61, and he too served the legal maximum in America of 2 terms as president. To be succeeded by John F. Kennedy, the youngest president in American history, representing the Democrat Party from 1961 until his assassination in 1963, whereupon he was succeeded by his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, who finished Kennedy's initial term in office and then won a subsequent election in 1964, but did not choose to run for a second election in 1969. Richard Nixon, winning after Lyndon Johnson's standing aside, representing the Republican Party from 1969 to 1974. It should also be noted that Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president during his term in office. Then we move on to the State Department, the Secretary of State, the equivalent of the British Foreign Office, responsible for US external relations. The head of department is the Secretary of State, and the relationship between the Secretary of State and the President is vital to conducting successful foreign policy. The State Department runs the day-to-day transactions of American foreign policy, directed by the President. So the Secretaries of State between 1945 and 1973 as follows. Harry Truman had George Marshall, he of the Marshall Plan, followed by Dean Acheson. Dwight Eisenhower had John Foster Dulles. Kennedy had Dean Rusk, and Johnson inherited Dean Rusk. Nixon had Henry Kissinger. It should be noted that Dean Rusk under Kennedy was somewhat sidelined because of the relationship between Kennedy and his Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. But one must also remember that Kennedy's presidency was dominated by the Cuban Missile Crisis and subsequently the American increasing involvement in Vietnam. The NSC, Defense Department and CIA. All of these were formed in 1947. These institutions had not existed because America as an isolationist country before 1945 had no need of institutions that would help her become a global power, an international, non-isolationist country. So they were relatively new institutions. They form the second layer of foreign policy. They are in turn responsible for funneling information and advice to the President and implementing the decision taken by the President. The CIA during this period had an escalating budget for intelligence gathering and covert ops as the Cold War intensified. Now Congress, they have legislative power, not executive power. So they're not so much the ones who initiate the laws, but they're the ones who check the laws. They ensure that the President is not abusing his power. Like the British system, they have two chambers, an upper and a lower, the Senate being the upper house, and the representatives being the lower house. They are elected separately from each other and separately from the President. Therefore, America is in a constant cycle of elections, constantly changing the nature of power and authority, which means you could easily have a Republican president, a Democrat House of Representatives, and a Republican Senate, everyone watching everyone else. Only Congress has the right to declare a war. All foreign treaties discussed by the President must be approved by the Senate, and the Senate Foreign Policy Committee can call foreign policy makers before it and question their conduct. All presidential nominees for foreign policy posts have to be confirmed by the Senate, so it's these checks and balances. Congress can veto foreign policy treaties, and therefore all foreign policy decisions and actions that are taken are often a product of cooperation between the legislature and the executive. And bigger than this again is the US Supreme Court that checks both the Congress and the President, the legislature and the executive, to make sure that everything being done is constitutional and legal. Now, public opinion is the most remote influence on foreign policy decisions, yet as we've already said, to counter this, the constant cycle of elections mean that no president can be elected for 4 years and then immediately ignore popular opinion, because the American system means a constant scrutiny of the executive and the legislature through a constant process of rolling elections. They generally responded positively to presidential leadership on foreign policy. They took the back seat and allowed the president to drive this forward. Between 45 and 63, there is broad public support for the anti-communist foreign policy pursued by successive administrations. As we have discussed when talking about ideology, there is something deep in the psyche of Americans that have them and with strong antipathy towards communism. They want communism stopped. It's anti-American. It's un-American. It's a threat to America and their way of lives. They don't understand it, and ideologically their response is to confront it. However, that history of isolationism meant that many US citizens were uninterested or poorly informed about world events. So at this early stage, they were willing to be led by the president. Public opinion, therefore, throughout this process, had a limited impact on the formulation of foreign policy. And most evident was why the way during the Vietnam War that America became embroiled, but then very quickly lost contact with public opinion on the pursuit of the war.